People have conducted, created resumes or CVs with story maps. I've done that. I preach to students all the time, you should do this. And I finally said, Joseph, if you're going to preach to do this, you've got to do one yourself. So I've done that, and other people have done that. So what about an event? You can use it for an event, a portfolio for a project. You could use it for instruction, for tutorials. So we actually have a lot of how to make a heat map. Well, we use a story map to teach that. So lots of things you can do, not just to teach geotechy types of stuff, but how do you teach about ecoregions, population change, etc., with story maps. So lots of ways that you can use story maps, engaging constituents, engaging the public, and so on and so forth. You can see here, you can use it for creating an atlas. So browse through here sometime, briefings, presentations, newsletters, etc. Okay, web pages, etc. That is things you didn't know you could do with story maps. Now, this next part gets into a little bit of geo geekiness, a little bit of GIS talk, but hopefully not too in the weeds here, but I think it's helpful to know, okay, where do these sit inside the whole ArcGIS Esri framework? How can I use them, etc. Just as an introduction, these are part, as I indicated before, of ArcGIS Online. So you're not, I think that's very good news actually for several reasons. You're not using some little niche thing, it's some little pet project of some, well-meaning person that, and the data sitting on their, some server underneath their knees, in a corner somewhere. That's actually part of the whole ArcGIS ecosystem of tools, maps, apps, etc. And so let's talk a little bit about maps versus applications. A web map is stored in this ArcGIS Online cloud, and it contains the full interface and set of tools so your users that you're sharing your map with can interact with it. So give you a really simple example here just to get started. This is a web map that I created inside ArcGIS Online showing my cycling route from New York City after a geography conference one time across the Hudson River on the George Washington Bridge, which I've always wanted to bicycle across, being a geographer. It's one of those very interesting landscapes culturally and physically. You think about the history and geography of the place. So over to this spot in New Jersey. Okay, so I had a GPS with me. I could have used my smartphone and collected the track as well, and then put it up into ArcGIS Online. So now you can actually pull up that same map, and you've got all the tools at your fingertips inside ArcGIS Online. So you can measure things, you can modify the map in the upper right, and then you can add and search for layers. You could search for additional layers like, for example, I don't know, some sort of maybe a soil layer. Or landforms, or climate, or vegetation, or population, or something like that. So you can search and add additional content in here because you are inside ArcGIS Online. And maybe I'll change the base map. Those sorts of things. You're giving the user the full interface. And of course, if they've got an account in ArcGIS Online, they can save a copy of what they modified. They can start with your map, modify it, save it, share it, create a story map from the individual web map that you see here. So, okay, so they can do that. That is a web map inside ArcGIS Online. So, okay, now a web mapping application is stored in the same environment in the ArcGIS Online cloud, but it contains a specialized or reduced set of tools for your end user to interact with. So for example, let's take that same theme, and I know it's a simple example, but hopefully it gets the point across. It's my same cycling route. Okay, so I wanted to tell the story of the neighborhoods that I cycled through. And in this case, I've got, okay, median age. So I wanted to show folks that, okay, as I cycled up through Central Park, et cetera, it's a bit young, and as I got into New Jersey, it's a little bit older in terms of median age. Why is that? Why do we see the patterns that we see? What impacts median age, et cetera? Okay, so this is a story map now, and it is, I've got some additional things in here. I've got that theme of median age, but I also have the 3D effect that you see here. Now, this isn't the Rocky Mountains. If you look at the scale over there on the left side, you see that it's basically 400 or 500 feet vertical. So I did get into the New Jersey Palisades, so it wasn't completely flat. But anyway, the point is that I now have this sort of interactivity with the tools that I've presented to the end user. The end user in this case, unlike the map I showed earlier, the end user here cannot modify this map, right? They cannot change anything. It is, do they still make Lunchables? You know what I'm talking about, folks? Anyway, maybe I'm dating myself. But they're this sort of rectangular lunch, right? And you've got a little packet of carrots, a little packet of, I don't know, green beans, a little packet of crackers, a little packet of cheese, and that's basically it. You can't modify it. It's there, and you buy it as a package, and that's what you consume. If you want to customize your own lunch, right, you go to the produce section, you go to other sections in the grocery store, and you're customizing. So here, this is sort of like a Lunchable. You're giving the user the end experience, and this is what they can do with it. They can't save it. They can't modify it. They can't interact with it other than the places that you've given them in their activity, right? So sure, this particular map that I'm using, it's centered on New York City, but I can do the same thing. I can look at median age anywhere I've got the data for that Joseph has decided to show me. So this is a web mapping application. It's a particular kind of story map for that same cycling route. So the point is, folks, is that story maps are applications. They're applications that are stored in the ArcGIS Online cloud, and they have a specific set of tabs, interactivity, base maps, thematic maps, and tools that they allow the author allows the end user to interact with. So here's another story map application. And since story maps are applications, they're really apps, but it just sounds cooler to call them story maps instead of story maps, right, folks? But they're really apps. So here's the same information, and now I've got it as a different kind of story map where I've got that tabbed experience, the series. So I show the different tapestry segmentation clusters. So high society, senior styles. I love these. Great for research and teaching. But you can see the different neighborhoods and according to the tapestry segmentation that I actually cycled through, as well as I've got another tapestry segment on another tab. But on this tab, I've got the diversity index. So 100 meaning more diversity, 1 meaning less diversity. So as I cycled through these neighborhoods, you can see the diversity index. Fascinating. So I've got that as well as the household income and so on. Anyway, fascinating. So this is another story map that I created from my initial data. Now, folks, that is just a little bit of technical detail, more later, but there are 3 main methods that create story maps. First of all, I talked about that sort of wizard interface earlier, the builder mode. Yeah, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. Method 2 is what I was demonstrating a moment ago, where you start with an ArcGIS Online map, you share it, and when you share it, you get a choice. Hey, do you want to create a story map from this? You say, yes, I do. Thank you very much. And you can create a story map from your existing web map. So if you've got a bunch of existing web maps that you've created at the Lincoln Institute, you can create a story map from it. You don't have to start completely over from scratch and do the builder mode. And method 3 is even more powerful. Probably won't have time today. We've only got 5 hours together. Just kidding, just kidding. Wanted to make sure you folks were listening. We don't have 5 hours, but even if we did, we might not even have time then to get into the configurable app. So basically the idea there is you're downloading a whole bunch of files from the Story Maps site. You configure those. You're just touching a few of them. You get a whole bunch of JavaScript and other files, HTML and others, and then you upload those to your own website, and they work. So you're customizing just a few of these files, and then you're really getting into even more power. I'm not going to go through all these. Yeah.
What kind of skills do you need for the configurable app?
Yeah, what kind of skills do you need for the configurable app? Well, I'm not a coder. I'm not a full-time programmer. I'm an educator, and I was able to create one of these in a few hours. So you download these files. You only tweak or adjust a few things. So, knowing a little bit of HTML helps. Knowing a little JavaScript helps, but you don't have to be a full-time coder. Now, the more you know in terms of what goes on behind the scenes in terms of WebGIS, the more powerful you're going to be with the customization. So if you've spent any time, for example, in the developer site, this is a great way to learn about about what goes on behind these maps. But the developer site, we've got some labs in there. So you start scrolling down developer.arcgis.com, and you have some tutorials with these labs. Oh, these are great. So as you can see here, some of these are 10 minutes long. So how do I use these tools? And so you're just dipping into a little bit of a toe into the coding water swimming pool, if you know what I mean. So you don't, again, have to set aside your regular full-time job and be a full-time coder to actually be taking advantage of the customization of the story maps. But I would spend a little time in here in this developer site, just, again, getting a few toes into the waters. I'm going to highlight just a few of these. Earlier I talked about my Lakota language story map, which didn't take long at all. The main learning curve there was just where do I park those little audio files of mine. So once I did that, I thought, gosh, there's going to be a lot of coding involved with making sure that that little play button works inside the story map. But guess what? Just to refresh your memory of what this looks like. This little play button on the left side of each one of my main images, because HTML5 is so smart, once I had the caption pointing to a MP3 audio file, it said, oh, Joseph's pointing to an audio file. He needs a player. And so it just appeared. I didn't have to code the player. It just appeared there, pointing to my MP3 file. Very nice. I did have to enter the text for each one of these, and I did have to record the audio, but that was a piece of cake. So again, you know, pointing to that whole idea of you don't have to be a full-time GIS person or a coder to use these effectively. Let me point to this one, if you don't mind, because it's an example of, I think, one of the things that you folks are interested in, and that is hosting these on your own website. Hosting some of these story maps on your own website. So here is the Alaska Department of Fish and Game at the top, as you can see there. And what they've done is they say, hey, we're going to address a concern. If we're going to live in Alaska, we've got to deal with bears, and they are in our community. So how do we actually learn to interact and live with them? What are their behaviors like? So if you go to the tab, notice it's a tabbed story map inside their Alaska Department of Fish and Game. So it's a story map inside their own webpage, so alaska.gov. So in this case, here's another, I think, interesting example of what story maps can do. If you go to interesting behaviors, you can see, as you would expect, a pop-up for each one of these points. And really interestingly, you can see the behavior of these bears, like this. So every time, folks, I think maybe I'm having a difficult day at work, I'm thinking, Joseph, at least you don't have to collar bears. We'll leave that to the professionals. But the idea here is that let's educate the community, right, in living with bears, and how do they cross streets? How do they swim? How do they protect their young, etc. So let's learn to live with these magnificent creatures, and let's use a story map to help the community understand where these bears are and what their behaviors are. So that was, I thought, a very effective way of using story maps. Here's another one, and this is a bit more involved, but there are thinking about, you know, your themes at Lincoln and all the good things that you're involved with. So here's part of our Atlas for a Changing Planet. So, you know, where are the forests? Why is deforestation a problem? You know, in bioclimates, what's a bioclimate? What's population density, and how do we measure it, and where do people live, and so on. So each one of these, in this case a map journal, has a different theme, and you've got metadata possibilities here too. So in this case, we've got the source on there, which of course I always encourage people to do. Where are you getting your data from, right? Where's it coming from? You know, what scale was it collected at? How often is it updated? And so on and so forth. All of that sort of stuff. Okay, so that is another story map that I wanted to highlight, the Atlas for a Changing Planet. Now let's just get into this very lightly, because I know you folks are great communicators there at the Lincoln Institute, and that's one of the reasons why I have such great respect for you. You really get it in terms of, yeah, we're producing data, we're doing research, but here's a way for us to communicate it to our audience. So you really get this, but just to remind maybe some colleagues that you're kind of trying to bring into the fold here, these are some clues that I'd like to highlight. Think about, this isn't actually my real mom, but if it were, I mean, think about talking about, story maps to your family members. How do you talk about GIS or your goals of the Lincoln Institute? You're being respectful, but you're not using a lot of jargon. A lot of times people say, well, if you can explain what you do at work to your own family or friends, then you've really succeeded. You've really mastered the whole art of communication. So that has implications for story maps, because you want to have some sort of titles that are active, descriptive, that bring people in. You can't just build it and they will come, right? You have to think about how you're communicating. Also, think about the different app types that I talked about earlier, and that is to indicate that, maps serve a lot of purposes. So think about the kind of story map that you're going to be able to create, and then choose the app that matches your goal. You can't change the app type at this point, early 2019, to halfway through. Now, these are dynamic tools, right? So stay tuned, keep your knees bent, because sometime this year, we've been working with our development story maps team, and what we're going to have is a more interactive, immersive experience, sort of like giving all the tools like in Adobe Photoshop or Illustrator. So you are going to be able to choose different kinds of apps in the middle of your process later on this year. So, and some other enhancements as well. At the moment, though, you have to decide what kind of app am I going to make, and then I'm going to go down that pathway. I can't switch in the middle. So stay tuned. These tools are evolving. Also, as you know I know many of you actually are using GIS, you're going to think about, okay, if I'm going to show, my GIS cohort at Lincoln, my maps and my data, I can show it in its true complexity. But if you're going to share it with even the general public, or even people out in your research community outside of your own core group there, you're going to want to think about, what symbols am I using? How am I going to communicate this so that they understand what I'm trying to communicate? So a map for storytelling then is usually different from a map you're doing an analysis. So in the lower left, you've got your map in ArcMap, and you've got different tools, and you've got different layers and different things. But in the upper right, maybe your story map is a lot simpler in some ways. And again, simple is good in story maps. Doesn't mean that you're dumbing it down, but you're thinking about your audience once again. And so for a long time, Zoo Babies was our most popular story map. We could have called it Little Animals at the Washington Zoo, but no, Zoo Babies, wow, cool. Like, who doesn't love little animals, right? So the title is actually important. And it's kind of like, think back to your senior thesis or your master's thesis or your dissertation or whatever you folks have done in the past. Your advisors would always tell you, okay, that's great, but you've got to simplify it. You've got to shorten it. You've got to focus, right? So think about that with your story maps. And then just a couple of technical pieces of advice here, if you don't mind, folks. There is a zone, as we'll see here in a moment, called My Stories inside ArcGIS Online when you're making your story maps. Take advantage of that. It's a nice way for you to manage your content. So let's say in a year from now, you have 20 story maps, and you want to update them. You want to be able to manage them. You want to make sure all the links work, etc. For those of you that have developed web pages, it's much like that experience that you have in being a web developer. Most of your time is actually spent figuring out what's working, what's not working, right? What do I need to curate in the future? So make use of that My Story zone. Also give context of where your theme, your problem, your issue, your map is located. Oftentimes we see these wonderful story maps come out, and all of a sudden you're sort of, I'm turning my video on so you can see my hands gesturing. You're like right there in a very localized environment. You want to say, wait a minute, where is this? This is some sort of wetland. Where? Okay. And so give it some context, especially if your audience is coming into this like sort of cold and not knowing where this is located. Also, as you can even see in my screen sharing here, you've got to have a lot of tabs open when you're working with the WebGIS environment. So keep tabs on those tabs. Know which tab you're logged into in ArcGIS Online and which ones you're not logged into. If you're creating a story map, for example, you're right in the middle of edit mode, guess what? There's no like auto save, okay, like you have in a lot of applications. Mm-hmm. So if you use the back button right in the middle of an edit session, whatever you've done for the last 20 minutes since the last time you saved, It's gone. It's out orbiting Neptune or wherever it is at the moment. So the idea is, you want to keep track of how often you're saving and where you're logged in and so on. Also, there are folders inside ArcGIS Online, and just like you're always telling your colleagues, be organized about the work you're doing. There's still, even though GIS is a lot simpler than it was way back when I started, folks, well, we won't go there. The 20th century, we'll just lay it there, okay? But when I started with GIS, it was pretty laborious and clunky. Now, not to say that everything in GIS land nowadays is push button and poof. No, there's still, as you know, a lot of moving parts. So make life easier on yourself. Don't make things more complicated than they need to be. So use folders, be organized about your projects. And also, a no-brainer for you all, but I see some story maps a lot of times that people are using images that you can pretty much tell that they've just grabbed them from various places on the web. So be respectful of copyright and ownership, and you don't want to get a call from Bob's Photos Inc. someday, right, folks? Hey, I noticed you're using my photo in your story map. I don't recall giving you permission to do that. So, your own content or, Creative Commons. I used to work for U.S. federal agencies. A lot of that stuff is not copyrighted. Most of that stuff is not copyrighted. So keep that in mind. And also image size. Just because your wonderful device can take 10, 12 megabyte photographs and big old honking videos, think you're using the web, and maybe not everybody's got good connectivity like you do there at your own home bases there in Arizona and Massachusetts and the other places that you folks are hailing from today. So be conscious of that. You don't want to have a story map with 100 images and they're all 12 megabytes. You just don't want to go there. Yeah, things are getting better, but just be conscious of that. You could ignore these pieces of advice, folks, that I have, but if you do, your story maps will be sorry maps. Oh, get it, folks? Your story maps will be sorry maps. Are you folks with me? All right, maybe that wasn't very funny. Anyway, the point is that I think these are helpful. Hopefully you will too. All right, folks, moving right along there.